times homage to the Buddha. And today is November 14th, 2015. So we start with the homage to the Buddha 3 times. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so today we will be continuing with the study of Sutta number 140. Is blinding you? I think if we bring it up here, then we could point it. That's better? Okay. Okay, so we are continuing with the study of Sutta number 140 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the Dhātuvibhanga Sutta, the discourse on the analysis of elements. And before we resume where I left off last week, I'll just recapitulate the material that we've covered so far. So first, there's a little story behind this discourse that the Buddha arrives at a potter's shed, or he arrives at a potter's home, and he asks permission from the potter to spend the night in the potter's shed. And the potter tells the Buddha that it's quite all right with him, but there's already another ascetic, a renunciant, who is come and is staying in that shed. And so the Buddha goes to the shed, asks whether it's all right for him to stay there, and the other ascetic welcomes him, not knowing that he's the Buddha. And then they meditate through much of the night. Then late in the night, the Buddha opens a conversation with this young man and asks him, under whom has he gone forth? Who is his teacher? And the young man, according to the commentary, the young man was actually formerly the king of Takashila, which was in the state of Gandhara, that's in the northeast, present-day Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan. And after learning about the Dhamma through some merchants, this king renounced the kingdom, and on his own he took on the robes and went forth out of faith in the Buddha, though he had never met the Buddha before. And so he's come to this potter shed, and the Buddha opens this conversation, and the young man tells the Buddha that he has gone forth under or out of faith in the ascetic Gautama, whom they call the Buddha. The Buddha asks him, have you ever seen this Buddha before? And he says, no. And of course, since there were no photographs or TV in those days, he has no visual impression of what the Buddha looks like. And so the Buddha says, I'll teach you the Dhamma, and he starts to give a teaching to the young man who still doesn't know that this is the Buddha who is teaching him. Okay, then the Buddha opens the discourse by going through first an outline of certain topics, which in effect are sort of homing in very directly on the teaching of non-self or selflessness. And according to the commentary, this is because that young man, when he was, even before he met the Buddha, just on his own from some of the discourses of the Buddha that he had heard and read about, had started to practice, he had started to practice meditation on his own, and without any outside guidance, he had already attained the 4 jhanas, the 4 meditative absorptions. So he had strong samadhi or concentration. What he was lacking was the teaching on insight or on wisdom. So the Buddha goes directly into wisdom teachings by teaching him that the person consists of the 6 elements, the 6 sense bases, the 18 kinds of mental exploration. Then he speaks about 4 foundations, the 4 adhitthana, foundations or standpoints. And these 4 foundations are wisdom, the 4 foundations are wisdom, truth, relinquishment, and peace. Okay, then the Buddha picks up on the teaching of wisdom, that one should not neglect wisdom. And then to expound or to explain this statement, not neglecting wisdom, the Buddha explains to him the meditation on the 6 elements, going through the 4 material elements, the space element, and then the consciousness element, which he treats in terms of the contemplation of feeling. And then he takes the feeling through successively more refined levels until, here on page 1092, paragraph 20, there remains only equanimity, purified and bright. And so this, as we explained last week, seems to be the equanimity of the 4th jhana. And this is representing the consciousness element. And then the Buddha says that the meditator understands that if he were to direct this equanimity, pure and bright, to the base of infinite space, the base of infinite consciousness, the base of nothingness, the base of neither perception nor non-perception, then his consciousness might remain there for a very long time. This is indicating that if he develops the 4 formless or immaterial meditative attainments, the karma that's empowering that consciousness will direct the consciousness to rebirth into the 4, one of the 4 formless realms of existence, where the consciousness might remain for thousands of kalpas. Kalpas are the periods of cosmic expansion and contraction. But then the meditator realizes that if he were to direct that equanimity to any of these formless bases and to develop his mind accordingly, that would be conditioned. In a way, this is the key statement in the sutta, that even these very refined, very exalted, immaterial or formless meditative absorptions are conditioned. They are sort of underlying them, there is a subtle clinging. And because of that, the meditator, by seeing that all of these states are conditioned, he does not generate any volition tending towards either existence or non-existence. tending either from a wish to abide in these formless realms for thousands and tens of thousands of kalpas, nor does he seek annihilation, personal annihilation. So not generating any volition tending towards either existence or non-existence. He does not cling to anything in this world. And so through non-clinging, there is no agitation. Without agitation, he personally attains nibbana and understands birth is finished, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back to any state of being. Okay, so that is the point that we reached last week. And some people after the class, they asked me about this verb. I mentioned that there's a verb in Pali which has two nuances that get combined. Actually, a verb in Pali that represents two different Sanskrit verbs which somehow get merged and conflated in Pali. And this is the verb that I represent here rather inadequately by the expression, he is not agitated. Yeah, so the Pali verb is paritasati. Pari is just a prefix, so the real stem part of the verb is tasati. Okay, now this represents, coming from Sanskrit, we have a verb paritrishyate, which means to have craving. And it's actually related to the English word thirst, you could see. You could see there's some similarity. And it's also from trishyate that we get in Sanskrit the noun Trishna. You know, Hare Krishna. Hare. And that becomes in Pali, Trishna becomes in Pali tanha, which is the word for craving. So from the verb trishyate, we get Trishna, Sanskrit, and Trishna is, I should say, the equivalent, the Sanskrit equivalent of Pali tanha. Because in Pali, we don't have these two letters, and so the R usually turns into an A or sometimes a U. And the sh sound is too hard to replicate in Pali, so it becomes tanha. So we have paritrishyate, giving paritasati, and this means to crave, to have, literally to have thirst in the sense of strong desire, to crave. But then there's another Sanskrit verb, trasyate, which means to be afraid. And if we want to represent trasyate in Pali, it would become also tasati. And so this verb also feeds in to paritasati. So paritasati has these two nuances of craving and fear. And it's not somebody who suggested to me, well, that shows the psychological connection between craving and fear. You know, I say that there might be such a psychological connection, but that's not the reason for this. This is purely what you might call a coincidence, a linguistic coincidence, that two verbs which are quite different in Sanskrit, when they get converted into Pali, they take on almost the same forms. Okay, so that brings us where we came last week, was up to the this would be the attainment of arahantship, the realization of nibbana, and then the what's called the reviewing knowledge or the reflective knowledge that one has finished the job, so to speak, by eradicating all craving and putting an end to the cycle of birth and death. And so now, the continuation of the sutta, this shows what is called the arahat's abiding while alive, especially now in relation to feeling. Okay, so the text says, if he feels a pleasant feeling, he understands it is impermanent. There is no holding to it, no clinging to it, and no delight in it. Again, if he feels a painful feeling, the same. If he feels a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, again the same. Impermanent, there is no holding to it, no delight in it. And so the consequence of that, or just stating the same thing in a somewhat different way, if he feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it detached. Similarly, a painful feeling, a neutral feeling, he feels it detached. And so when he feels a feeling terminating with the body, he understands, I feel a feeling terminating with the body. When he feels a feeling terminating with life, he understands, I feel a feeling terminating with life. And the way I would understand this is that when he experiences any of these feelings, pleasant, painful, or neutral, he understands that these feelings continue only as long as the body stands and as long as the life faculty continues to function. And so he understands, continuing, that on the dissolution of the body, with the ending of life, all that is felt, not being delighted in, will become cool right here. Okay, and this is referring to what's called the nibbana element without residue remaining. So we could say that the previous statements are referring to the nibbana element with a residue remaining. That is the nibbana experienced while one is alive. But now, with the statement on the dissolution of the body with the ending of life, this is going to show the nibbana element with no residue remaining. And the residue are the 5 aggregates that have been brought into being into this life through previous ignorance and craving. And so in an ordinary person, the 5 aggregates come into existence with conception or birth. They continue through the duration of life. And because there's still ignorance and craving within them, sort of underlying them, when these 5 aggregates break up at death, then there's still that ignorance and craving within them that will bring into being a new set of 5 aggregates to continue to keep the process of becoming, evolving or revolving from life to life. But the arhat, or liberated one, has extinguished craving and ignorance. So he knows that on the dissolution of the body at the end of life, since there is no more ignorance and craving, there will be no more re-arising of the 5 aggregates. And so all that is felt here in this life, since it's not being delighted in, there's no attachment and clinging to it, the expression used is that it becomes cool. Sometimes some people think that this means that the arhat is annihilated at death, but what the Buddha teaches is no eternal existence, no annihilation, but rather what I prefer to say is to use a verb and to say that the arhat becomes nibbanized with his death. Okay, then the Buddha illustrates this with the example of the oil lamp. So the oil lamp burns in dependence on oil and a wick, and then when the oil and the wick are used up and it doesn't get any more fuel, then it is extinguished. It goes out from lack of fuel. And so too, when the feelings are not delighted in, see, the delight in the feelings, that is like providing fuel to the fire of craving and ignorance. But when the feelings are not delighted in, then there's no more craving and ignorance. And so then, with the dissolution of the body, with the ending of life, all that is felt, not being delighted in, becomes cool right here. Okay, now at this point, this actually concludes the Buddha's exposition of the foundation of wisdom, which he had started way back when he began to explain the contemplation of the 6 elements. That is, when you go back to page 1089, section 13, the Buddha raises the question. He says, how does one not neglect wisdom? Then he introduces the 6 elements, explains them in turn, and then brings the treatment up to the attainment first of, you call this enlightenment or realization in this life, then the nibbana element with residue remaining, that is the arahat's dwelling in the contemplation of feeling, and then the attainment of the nibbana element without residue remaining. So all of that is incorporated under the development of wisdom. And so now the Buddha sort of sums up what has been said to this point. He says, therefore, a bhikkhu or a monk possessing this wisdom possesses the supreme foundation of wisdom. For this is the supreme noble wisdom, namely the knowledge of the destruction of all suffering, of all dukkha. So this is, I mentioned that there are 4 foundations or adhitanas. Okay, the first is called, this is the supreme foundation of wisdom, the Panya Adhitana. And maybe some of you who have done meditation courses in the Goenka tradition might know the word adhitana with a somewhat different meaning. The word adhitana has another meaning, which is resolve or determination. Like when you make the determination, I will sit for 1 hour without changing my posture, that determination, that's also adhitana. But here adhitana is being used in a different sense of the foundation or groundwork for something. And so these adhitanas are things, qualities that one develops in the course of practice. And then when they come to fulfillment, then they become the supreme or unsurpassed adhitana, the unsurpassed foundation. And so now this whole process of developing wisdom, one could say, has been the development of the Panya Adhitana, the foundation of wisdom. And then when that wisdom blossoms and matures in the knowledge that all dukkha has been destroyed, then it becomes the supreme foundation of wisdom. Okay, next, now the Buddha is going to go through each of the 4 adhitanas. So now we come to the second one. He says that his deliverance, or actually now I prefer the word liberation. I think the Sri Lankans back in the 1940s, a little influence of a Christian terminology. So one gets, Jesus is my deliverance. And so they picked up in rendering Buddhist texts, they picked up that expression. And so I continued it through back in those days. I think Nyanamoli used deliverance, but now I would prefer liberation. Its Pali word is vimutti. So his liberation, being founded upon truth, is unshakable. For that is false, which has a deceptive nature, and that is true, which has an undeceptive nature, that is nibbana. Okay, this is maybe a statement very pregnant with meanings, that is false, which has a deceptive nature. And there's 2 words here. First, the word translated false, the Pali word is musa. And this is the word, you might be familiar with this, when you take the 5 precepts, the 4th precept is musa vada viramani sikapadang samadhiyami. I undertake the precept to abstain from false speech. And then the other word, which is deceptive nature, the Pali expression is mosa dhamma. Dhamma here, as the second part of a compound, means the nature. And it seems mosa must be derived from musa, false. So you could even say, but it sounds tautological to say, that is false, which has a false nature. But I've tried to figure out, if something has a false nature, how is it just not a tautology? So the way I would understand it is that which deceives us is what is false. And what deceives us, or how it deceives us, are things that deceive us by making us take them to be permanent sources of pleasure and security, and to be our true identity, our self. And so what the Buddha teaches are all conditioned things are impermanent, unsatisfactory and insecure, and not ourself. And so to see them rightly is to see them without deception, is to see things as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. But for ordinary people whose minds are covered with delusion, we see them falsely. And so things have a deceptive nature because they deceive our minds. Okay, so everything with the deceptive nature, everything which is all these impermanent conditioned things, the text says, are false. But that which has an undeceptive nature, which cannot mislead, that is true, the ultimate truth. And that ultimate truth is Nibbana. And so therefore the Buddha says, a bhikkhu possessing this truth possesses the supreme foundation of truth. For this is the supreme noble truth. That is Nibbana, which has an undeceptive nature. And here the expression noble truth is Arya Satya. So that puts Nibbana within the four noble truths. And so we have, the four noble truths are suffering, craving is the origin of suffering, then the cessation of suffering, which is Nibbana, and the Noble Eightfold Path, the way to the cessation of suffering. So of these four noble truths, the first noble truth is something to be seen through, to be fully understood and overcome. That is suffering, especially as dukkha as expressed in the five aggregates. The second noble truth is craving, which is to be discarded or abandoned. And so those are negative noble truths. But even the noble truth of the path is not the ultimate. The path is the means to the goal. And so the path is a noble truth, and it's also a noble practice, but it's not the supreme noble truth, because the supreme noble truth is the goal to which the path leads. And that is Nibbana, the third noble truth, which is the cessation of all suffering. Okay, so this is the second foundation, which in Pali is Satya Adhitthana. And the word Satya here, it's exactly the same as the word Satya in the Four Noble Truths. Chattari Arya Satyani. Okay, now we come to the next foundation, So he says, formally, and here, it's difficult to render one language exactly into another language. And sometimes we don't have words that correspond exactly to, which can capture the precise nuances of the word in the original language. So here we say, formerly, when he was ignorant, when this person was ignorant, he undertook and accepted acquisitions. I'll come back and explain that. Now he has abandoned them, cut them off at the root, made them like a palm stump, done away with them, so that they are no longer subject to future arising. Okay, the word rendered acquisitions here again, it's one of those words that we don't have an exact counterpart in English. At one point I tried experimenting not with acquisitions, but assets. Usually we think assets are things which are desirable, good to have. A person is evaluated in terms of his assets. How much are you worth? That's your value as a person. What you have in your bank account and your stock holdings and your property holdings, the assets. Okay, but the word upadhi, according to the commentaries, it has, I think, 4 meanings, suggests 4 things. One are the defilements. So greed, hatred, delusion, all the others are our assets, things to be relinquished. Another meaning of upadhi are the 5 aggregates, because those are the things that we cling to and hold to as being mine and I. Then a third type of assets or upadhi are external properties or belongings. So I have, this is my house, my car, my land, my job, my bank deposits, my bank account, my stock holdings, even my sons and daughters, wife and husband, all of those things that we hold to and take to be mine, things that sort of define me as a person, those are also acquisitions or assets. So that's the third sense of upadhi. And then the fourth sense are karmic accumulations, because we do good and bad deeds, and thereby we create wholesome and unwholesome karma, and that karma stays with us. That is really, we say, if anything is ours, it's the deeds that we do, and the karma that's generated by the deeds that we do. And so that karma is, accumulated karma, is a kind of acquisitions or assets. And so for the Buddha, for the ordinary person, the aim, the aspiration is to acquire more and more assets to build up one's acquisitions. Isn't there the expression in the business world? We have it, when one company acquires another, you call that that's a hostile takeover. Is there another expression used with acquisition? What is it? Yeah, merger, but I'm looking for one with the word acquisition. maybe we could just say one company acquires another, so that's an acquisition. And when it acquires the other, it takes over the other the victim company's assets. Okay, so that is the way one has a positive valuation on upadhi. Or what the Buddha says is that the aim is to abandon these acquisitions, to cut them off at the root, make them like a palm stump which cannot grow again, do away with them so they are no longer subject to future arising. And so then the Buddha says, therefore, one possessing this relinquishment possesses the supreme possesses the supreme foundation of relinquishment, for this is the supreme noble relinquishment, that is the relinquishing of all acquisitions. And the word for relinquishing is pati nisagga. Oh, I'm sorry, it's pati nisagga. But the word that's used here is chaga. Chaga aditana. So that the supreme noble or the foundation of relinquishment is chaga aditana, and that's explained as the relinquishing pati nisagga of all acquisitions. Pati nisagga is sort of casting away, discarding, giving up of all acquisitions. Okay, now we come to the fourth foundation. So the text says, when he was ignorant, that is before developing wisdom, he experienced covetousness, desire, and lust. Now he has abandoned them, cut them off at the root, and so on. Formerly he experienced and here these terms, covetousness, desire, lust, they're used just as synonyms for the same thing. So in a way they all represent the unwholesome root of greed. Then the second case, he experienced anger, ill will, and hate. Now he has abandoned them, given them up. So anger, ill will, and hate, these are just synonyms for the second unwholesome root, which is dosa, hatred. Then formerly, when he was ignorant, he experienced ignorance and delusion. Again, these are just two synonyms for the unwholesome root of moha, delusion. So now he has abandoned them, cut them off at the root, made them like a palm stump, done away with them so they are no longer subject to future arising. So a bhikkhu possessing this peace possesses the supreme foundation of peace, for this is the supreme noble peace, namely the pacification, the appeasement, calming down of lust, hate, and delusion. And here the word, the operative term here is upasama. So upasama is being used in this passage actually in two senses. One is in the sense of peace, that experienced peace, and the other where we have the pacification of lust, hate, and delusion is the calming down, quieting down, subsiding of these defilements. And so the point that's being conveyed is that it's through the pacification or the calming down and stopping of these defilements that one enjoys the experience of peace. Okay, so now the Buddha sort of sums up this whole long passage that started back with section 11 on page 1089. Now he sort of sums everything up by saying, so it was with reference to this that it was said, one should not neglect wisdom, should preserve truth, should cultivate relinquishment, and should train for peace. Okay, maybe I'll ask whether there's any questions at this point on what we've covered so far. Excuse me? Is somebody speaking? You are? Oh. Oh, I see you were testing. Say again? Yeah, it's used for renunciation. Yeah, the word nekama does mean renunciation, but it's just not used here. I mean, he has to select some words. Excuse me? Well, I think I explained it the way it's stated in the text. That the meaning, that there are two meanings. One is we call it pacification in the sense of the stilling and stopping of greed, hatred, and delusion. And then sort of building on that is the experiential peace, which is what people aspire for. These words. Yeah, these are the words that are used in the text. Any other questions? Okay, then we will continue with the sutta. Okay, now the Buddha is going back to when he gave the opening statement to the young monk after they had exchanged greetings in the potter's shed, when he was giving the outline of the teaching. He said one of the statements that he made was that the tides of conceiving do not sweep over one who stands on these foundations. And when the tides of conceiving no longer sweep over him, he is called a sage at peace. So that was a kind of concise statement that the Buddha made. Now he's going to elaborate upon it. And here we have an expression that I rendered tides of conceiving, or maybe we should say tides of misconceiving. It's a very unusual expression that occurs. I don't think it occurs elsewhere. Yeah, the expression rendered tides of conceiving is man-yusava. The manya part represents manyita, which means something which is conceived or maybe in the sense of being misconceived, a misconception, an idea which is infected with delusion, we can say. And usava is something which swells up. So these are swellings up, or swellings, you could say swellings of deluded ideas. And normally for ordinary people, these tides of conceiving, these swellings of deluded ideas rise up and overwhelm us, and so we are carried away by them. But one who has established these four foundations and perfected them, that is the Arahat, is said that the tides of conceiving no longer sweep over him. And so what are these manyita, these conceivings or misconceptions? And so the next passage states what they are. First comes, in a way there's a sequence here. And it starts with the most fundamental misconception is, I am, asmi. That sort of at the center of all my experience, there's some kind of I, which is, it's not even yet considered as a self, but it's just the vague notion that things are happening to me. And when I do things, that I am the one who does things. So this vague, I call it a nebulous notion of an